a demon.
The church rarely grants exorcism.
It's the only way.
I thought it was just some sort of weird...
We are talking Exorcism in Utero. This is written and directed by Erik Skybak. Boy, this was a strange one. So this is a low-budget, kind of B-movie, of exorcism movie, but there's elements of Rear Window and Fright Night meets kind of Rosemary's Baby, is the best way I would describe it, but all through a kind of somewhat schlocky B-movie lens. Does that sound something like you'd be interested in? Okay, so what is the story? Well, it focuses on this particular kind of neighbourhood and really two households. There's this one particular household where there's this seemingly devout Christian family that live there. But we learn that they might be into some kind of weirder stuff because we see the neighbours, the young son of the neighbours, kind of spying through their window, and he witnesses some kind of more bizarre stuff. But they are going on vacation for a while, so they basically hire a house sitter, this young woman called Herma, who, unbeknownst to anyone, is actually in the early stages of pregnancy. So she kind of stays there and sort of uncovers a sort of secret dungeon, so to speak, where there is some bizarre stuff down there, including this kind of like odd ring that she puts on and then seems to become under the influence of otherworldly forces that affects both her and her unborn baby. In the meantime, you've kind of got this neighbour kind of family who are sort of, the son is kind of witnessing it, and he's the sort of the one who's trying to alert his other family members who don't really kind of believe him and think, you know, there's kind of something wrong, but ultimately everything will kind of collude at the kind of the end. So what will happen, you'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's talk about what works in this movie. This, like I've said, is a little bit of a weird one. There's distinctively odd tones in this film. But let me just tell you that the thing that I think people will remember the most about this film, without spoiling anything, the last kind of 10 minutes. I mean, this movie is kind of plays it not really like particularly like a horror movie in some ways. It's much more sort of comedic in some scenes and then matter of fact in others. But the end's kind of like, well, I suppose 5 minutes towards the end of the movie, it gets full on Peter Jackson in Dead Alive, Brain Dead mode is the best way I would describe it. I don't want to spoil it for you because it is a short sequence, but man, you know, it really takes you back to Evil Dead 2, to, you know, as I say, Brain Dead, Dead Alive, Bad Taste, those kind of early Peter Jackson works. But the weird thing compared to those is the movie is not like that until the very end of the film. You know, so when it happens, it's so out of left field that it's like you really appreciate the kind of like the weird sort of like very sort of violent tonal shift that it kind of goes in, and you enjoy it, especially if you're a fan of that type of movie. But you know, so that to me is the most memorable bit. I'm not going to say anything about it really other than that because I don't want to spoil what I think is probably the most memorable portion of the movie. But what about the rest of it? So the storyline is a little bizarre, I gotta be honest with you. It kind of like it meanders around a lot, but the basic story, I think, you know, when you could have just boiled it down to the very basic synopsis, I think is an interesting idea. You know, this kind of house sitter unknowingly kind of going into some sort of demonic cult's house and ultimately becoming affected to it, and how the neighbours react to it. You know, that's an interesting idea, and I think it's you know, a little bit of a different take on the tried and tested kind of possession / exorcism kind of movies that we've seen to this point. So the basic idea, I think, is interesting. The characters and the acting. Okay, so the acting isn't brilliant, but I think it works for the film that it's in. is the best way I would describe it. I mean, the actors here are, they're not, you wouldn't exactly call it realistic kind of, you know, acting or characterization, but it strangely works in a B-movie fashion, I think. So it's not kind of distractingly pulls you out of the film, because you kind of, I think you'll probably be knowing this, you know, knowingly watching this with a kind of a B-movie schlocky lens, and in which case I think the acting for the most part works. And also, I gotta say, some of the sort of the more matter-of-fact reactions that the characters have in this movie, compared to some of the sort of the more typical ones you'll see in Hollywood, I think are actually quite refreshing. So I quite like that. And then we have, you know, we have some sort of fairly kind of interesting sort of characters. You know, we have this kind of neighbour, this neighbourhood family, and like the dad is like this English guy who does this like comedy swearing all the time, which I thought was quite funny. And the wife is, you know, it's somewhat funny at times. He's just kind of swearing loads, and then the wife just like explains to this local witch, oh, he's English, and that's what they do. So that's, I found that obviously as an English person quite funny. But just the kind of like the way that, for example, the young son will kind of is the one that in the family that is kind of more clued up about it. So he ends up kind of becoming sort of associated with this priest, and then you know, the family walk into his room and there's like, son, there's a priest in your room. Why is there a priest in your room? Things like that. So there is some kind of quite fun comedic moments, and it's not overplayed necessarily. It's very matter of fact, and I quite like that. And I have to say as well, considering this is a lower budget movie, again, it does things slightly differently. Herma, who is this kind of pregnant woman, I mean, she's becoming clearly like physically affected by these kind of demonic forces, and she physically changes into a kind of like weird witch-looking kind of character. So much so that the neighbours don't even recognise her, and I quite like the makeup. But it's like you know, it's fairly well done, but like the neighbours don't really react to it. It's just kind of like, well, who's that? Why she not like freaked out necessarily about it. So it's a little different. It just plays it a little differently to what I think you'd expect. So you know, it's kind of like has this weird sort of like fun element to it that I was kind of like, I think you don't see in some films. Purely because it's so off-kilter a lot of the times. It's just a bizarre film in some ways. But, you know, I don't know if it's wholly intentional, you know. It just seems like it's just the way it's kind of ended up. The movie is not scary at all. I mean, it has, like, as I say, a somewhat violent scene at the end, and arguably you can say that's a little disturbing, but, you know, it's not really scary at any point. In actual fact, it's not, although it's not a direct comedy, it's certainly more sort of comedic. But like the character of Herma, she plays it pretty straight. So it's her character who's the girl who's kind of pregnant, who's house sitting. You know, she's playing it relatively kind of straight, and it's just the sort of the characters around her seem a little bit kind of like different. Is the best way to describe it. But it has elements of a lot of other films, as I've mentioned, Fright Night and things like this, so you'll kind of recognise that it's obviously clearly influenced by a lot of kind of horror fare and things like this. Now, what doesn't work, the movie I think is a little directionless. So you kind of, the setup is okay. I think, you know, we were introduced to our sort of characters, and I think the setup works pretty well. But once we kind of get Herma starting to kind of be affected by these kind of demonic forces, it just kind of spins its wheels. And it has a lot of kind of like dream sequences, and some you're not really sure if that's actually meant to be a dream sequence and stuff. And then I feel, I've got to be honest with you, I feel that the Act 2 is a lot of white noise in this film. There's some fun elements to it, but narratively I think it's quite weak in that respect. It just kind of like seems to be meandering around, just kind of like going from one skit to another. Herma, again, who's the character who is being affected, seems to become severely physically kind of like affected by this kind of force, but she never kind of even thinks about kind of calling a doctor or something, or going to a hospital or anything like that. And you could argue that she's under the influence of demonic forces, and certainly that's later on in the film she appears to be more like that. But initially she seems to have her wits about her completely. So it's odd that that's never really kind of addressed. Eventually our neighbours will sort of end up saying something, but you know, it's just a little weird. And the way that the priest is introduced, I found, was very kind of like, just kind of like shoved in there for no real reason. Didn't really seem particularly kind of organic. So story-wise, I felt this movie is a little bit of a mess. Like I said, it works in some respects, but you know, the Act 2, I think, is just, it doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know what to do with the story. The movie is very low budget, and it has this kind of low budget feel all the way through it. Some of the kind of like the way this movie is shot just feels like it's kind of like, you know, just shot on not a particularly kind of like high grade camera at times. I think it just has this kind of like cheap kind of TV feel to it. It's the best way I would kind of describe it. It doesn't look like some of the acting, as I've mentioned, is not the best. I think it works for the context of the movie, but there are times here where I think people will, if you were to look at a scene from this, you would think the acting is a little weak. But I've got to say, I think you can kind of get away with it in this movie. The effects, you know, the interesting thing here as well is with the effects that they're not really played to be scary. I mean, when Herma is transforming into more of this kind of witch kind of like aesthetic, it's not really played to be scary. It's just like she just is like that and just walking around the house in normal kind of light, but just this kind of like fright makeup. So it kind of deflates any type of kind of horror elements really, and it just kind of looks like she's a woman dressed up in makeup for Halloween or something, ready to go out. So it kind of has that that aesthetic. And then I got to say as well, the family who originally are living in this kind of house, I feel the movie doesn't do enough to deal with those characters. Is the best way I would kind of describe it. They're kind of more left to, you know, as an unanswered question to a large degree. So, you know, do I think this is a good film? You know, well, how do I rate this film? I don't honestly think I could say this is a you know, a good movie, or you know, in any real way, because it's just narratively is the biggest problem for me. I just think it's very directionless and kind of in that respect. But there are entertainment value here. You know, I think you can kind of watch this and be entertained by at least parts of it, especially, as I say, towards the end. And I think the general setup is okay, and you can appreciate the kind of the references and things. But I don't know if it completely works as a full movie. I think it's needed to have another writer on it, or a producer kind of pushing back on the writer-director here. So it's an okay watch, but it's you know, I have to be honest with you, it's probably a slightly below average mark, but I would suggest checking it out if you sound like it's something you'd like. So I'll give it a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.